The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel. Presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.
Mike, I never thought I'd be saying this, but today we're joined by Peter Mansbridge. How do you feel?
It's a little surreal that, I never thought, when we started this podcast in June of 2021, that, you and I would be sitting here one day saying, that was a great chat we just had with Peter Mansbridge, but here we are.
Yeah, I mean, we're here to talk about, obviously, Peter's life and his new book, Off the Record. I think we're not going to belabor this any longer. I think we should just get our listeners into the interview. So without any further ado, we give you Peter Mansbridge.
So we're now pleased to be joined by a man who needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him one anyway. Peter Mansbridge, former chief correspondent for the CBC and the anchor of CBC's flagship show, The National, where he reported on stories from around the world. Peter also has a new book, Off the Record, where he shares never before told stories from his distinguished career, including reporting on the fall of the Berlin Wall, the horrors of 9/11, walking the beaches of Normandy with Tom Brokaw, and talking with Canadian prime ministers from John Diefenbaker to Justin Trudeau. Today, he is the host of the aptly titled podcast, The Bridge with Peter Mansbridge, and now a guest on the Unlikely Innovators. So Peter Mansbridge, welcome to the show.
Hey, Mike, Steve, good to talk to you.
Thanks for coming on. So one of the reasons why I reached out to you is because I was reading your book over the holidays, and we'll get to the book in a little bit. But one of the things that jumped out at me in trying to think about our own podcast is like the unlikely career paths that a lot of our guests have had. And in reading your book, Off the Record, perhaps there's nothing as quite unlikely as going from a baggage handler to eventually the chief correspondent for the CBC. So maybe can we start with that and maybe share some insights on that?
It was a pretty unlikely start. And I have to pinch myself every once in a while when I think of how lucky I was. And I also get used to looking at the faces of young journalism students who, when they hear the story, go, that's just not fair, considering what they're going through. Listen, I didn't finish high school. I went to high school in Ottawa. I didn't finish high school. I'm not proud of that fact, but it was a fact. So off I went. I joined the Navy for a little while. That didn't work out too well. I ended up in northern Manitoba working for a small airline called Transair. And it was during that time where I was literally doing everything from baggage handling to loading freight to checking in passengers, the whole gamut of different things that happen at a small airline. And one day somebody asked me to announce the flight over the PA system, which I did. And the next thing I knew, there was a guy in the terminal building who came up to me and said, "Hey, you got a good voice. I'm the manager of the local radio station here, a CBC Northern Service Station. And, I've got an opening late at night. I can't get anybody to do it. I've tried everybody. Would you be interested?" And that's how it started. I started the next night after like a 10-minute training course on how to run the knobs, the control knobs, which is kind of like doing a podcast today, or you do everything. And that's what I did in those days. So that's how it started. That was 1968, which sounds like totally unfair for those who want to get into this business, but it was a different era. I mean, if that same job was open today, there'd be 200 journalism grads applying for it. Back then, there was literally nobody who wanted the job. And so I got it, and I worked my tail off because I had no training, no background, nothing in terms of news. And so I basically taught myself. There was no newscast in Churchill. I suggested starting one because I was always interested in things that were going on around me. And then one thing led to another.
That's so unlikely, Peter. And I just have to tell you, when I was about 19, I worked at the Sudbury Airport for a few summers as a summer student. And it's sometimes a frantic place when you're running here to there. And it's hard to find people sometimes, and you have radios and things like that. What if you hadn't been available that day at the airport to make that announcement? Have you ever thought about where your career and life might have taken you if you weren't available? Because there were tons of times where people couldn't find me, at the airport. What do you think about that?
I'd probably still be at the Churchill airport, moving bags or trying to convince people my age that I could still move bags. Listen, luck plays a role in a lot of people's lives. I'd had opportunities up to that point. I'd had opportunities with great teachers great opportunities at high school, which I had not dealt with properly and didn't take advantage of. Then I had opportunities in the Navy. I was in pilot training. I would have flown off. At that point, we had an aircraft carrier, the Canadian Navy, the Bonaventure, off the East Coast. If I pursued that properly, that's where I would have ended up. So these one kind of not necessarily a failure, but a lost opportunity one after another for a young guy. I mean, I was 19, 20 years old when that happened in the Churchill airport. And I recognized as soon as I walked into that studio, hey, I love doing this. But I also recognized this was an opportunity, and this one I wasn't going to blow. I was going to work hard at it. And I worked really hard at it because I was behind the 8 ball in terms of experience. And, I had to make a name for myself. Then I moved from, Churchill to Winnipeg to Regina to start working for the National as a correspondent. Then to Ottawa as a parliamentary correspondent, a little bit overseas. And then they asked me to start doing some, weekend anchoring. And then that led to, the top job 20 years after that day in the airport in Churchill.
Wow. It's so interesting. We had Terry O'Reilly on a couple weeks ago, and he was talking about how these, little instances, in a person's life or like in the life of a product, because he often talks about advertising, can lead to these sort of monumental changes in that person's life. And I think, in his follow-up book, I think Peter Mansbridge might need a little chapter in that, because I think it really fits with that trope.
Yeah, well, listen, as I say, luck plays a part, but so does hard work. Nothing is replaceable for that quality of a person as well. You've got to believe in yourself. You got to believe that what you can do is anything's possible, and I believe that. I mean, as soon as I realized that broadcasting was what I wanted to do and journalism was what I wanted to do, I, in my head, wrote out a career path, and eventually I got to where that path in my head was, but it took a long time, and I didn't make every step of the way under the timetable that I wanted. So you have setbacks, but you deal with them. You believe in yourself, and you take the opportunities that are presented to you, and you learn from others. And those are, sort of basic qualities in any profession, and not just journalism.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a little bit, because Mike and I actually had the opportunity to see you from afar, of course, at an event. We saw you at the Colleges Ontario Higher Education Summit in 2019 when you were interviewing Edward Snowden. And it was a fantastic chat the two of you had virtually, of course, before virtual was sort of mandated by other things. But you still felt very personable and connected to Snowden while you were interviewing with him. A few months after this, of course, virtual conversations like the one we're having over Zoom became the norm. Could you talk about adjusting to that sort of virtual conversation method in the pandemic world? And how do you still maintain that connection with the people you interview?
That's a good question. I mean, listen, when I started up in Churchill, a lot of the guests I had, were at the other end of a long distance phone call. So in a way, that was virtual too. I mean, it was radio at that point before I moved into television. And, a lot of work, even through, the good times in the old National and Journal, a lot of that was done virtually. You weren't on location interviewing, Lech Wałęsa in Warsaw during the Solidarity days, or wherever the story happened to be. There were a lot of virtual interviews then. But the beauty of Zoom, as opposed to some of those, is you can see the person at the same time. And that kind of eye-to-eye, face-to-face contact. I mean, nothing replaces in person, but this is pretty close. And so you watch how a person reacts to your questions, and that can give you a feel, a vibe for what that interview is going to be like, and how far you can move towards trying to get to the answers you want. So listen, the last couple of years have been painful for an awful lot of people, as we know, but they've also offered us all opportunities with new technology, especially in our field of communications, that are kind of mind-boggling in a way. And some of them will stay with us, and we'll continue to incorporate them. But at the end of the day, nothing replaces the person-to-person, face-to-face, in the same room as your subject, and hopefully nothing will. I continue to be busy on the speech circuit, but a lot of it's virtual, and that disconnection, not just seeing the audience, but feeling the audience and hearing how they're reacting to what you're saying. I mean, I spoke to 1,000 people the other day in Alberta. Like, you don't see them because they're all in their homes. You see the occasional one when they're asking questions, but you don't see them as a group. And during your speech, you don't hear them. And you need that kind of vibe. You need to play off it properly and to have a good, have a good speech and a good conversation.
Yeah, I've often struggled with that too, because I do some hockey writing on the side for the LA Kings, and obviously me living in Sudbury, you can't really do in-person interviews with former, personnel and current players in the team. So oftentimes they were just done by telephone, and I found that sometimes I kind of got off the hook a bit because you didn't have to look them in the eye, and you couldn't pick up on, is this question I'm asking you, is this going to push a button? Like, should I not go down this road? So I find that, but in the Zoom world, I think now, being able to do podcasts like this and being able to see your guests, I think takes it to a whole new level, because certainly, it's one thing to ask somebody a question, but it's a whole different, when you have to look them in the eye to ask it. Right. So.
Right.
But the event that Steve mentioned, that was obviously one of the last in-person events that I went to as part of my job. And one of the things that Steve and I wanted to ask you, because the reason why we started this podcast was to try to elevate the applied research work that happens at colleges across Canada, chiefly, the work that we do here at Cambrian and Sudbury. But it's not, we're still in a world where, when Steve and I were going through high school, there was still a stigma around going to college, that it was seen as like the lesser path, that it was kind of university or bust, or you weren't going to get a good job. But I think us having now worked in the college system, like, that couldn't be further from the truth. There's so many, well-paying jobs and meaningful jobs that students get from college education. And, but there's still this kind of, misconceptions around college education. I'm just wondering, through the course of, maybe even your own, educational experience, but in the course of your reporting, do you have a take on the role, that colleges and other institutions in Canada play, especially with that hands-on component in helping to fill, the skills gaps that we currently have?
Right. Well, I can comment on that, but I commented on it from a position of a lack of experience. Having not finished high school, I never went to college or university. However, because of my career, I've been in a lot of universities, I've been in colleges, and I have, honorary degrees from both. So many so that I keep trying to make a trade. If I can trade a dozen of these, can I get a real one? Nobody snaps up that offer at the moment. Listen, I think things have changed, and you indicated that too, in terms of the perception of the different roles universities and colleges play. But they play together the same role, really, in giving the education and the qualifications for young people to move forward into real roles in society outside of their kind of schooling. And I think we've seen this. I was chancellor of the university for 8 years at Mount Allison in New Brunswick, and so I saw firsthand the quality of the graduates every year, because you have to, as chancellor, you're there at convocation. But during that time as well, there were students who were graduating from university who would tell me, okay, I'm done here, but now I'm going to a college because I want to get specific in one particular area, and they can do what universities can't do. And I think that's changed. 20 years ago, you wouldn't see that. It was kind of like beneath the discussion. Now it's very much a part of the discussion, and for good reason. because employers are looking for they're looking for graduates from both institutions, but truly they're looking for graduates from both institutions. And the marketplace for college graduates is just as vigorous and just as enticing to them as university graduates.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
remember.
and
Oh, sorry.
Mike,
Go ahead,
sorry.
Steve.
I was just going to agree. Obviously, it's changed a lot, but I think it's really that hands-on piece where colleges sort of, and then that sort of work integrated learning, learning on the job. If a student can come to a job and he or she is less, 50% less green than they would have been, straight out of school, I think that's a win for the employer and for the college that
Sure.
produced that grad, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, and I think we're going to talk about your book that Mike and I have read off the record. It's sort of weird when reading it. Few people when they write a memoir have so many significant historical events they could talk about when it comes to your own life and career. But off the record sort of reads as a history book. Like both Mike and I have history backgrounds. Mike has a PhD in Canadian history, and I have a master's in Canadian history. You were there for the fall of the Berlin Wall. The shooting at Parliament was particularly stirring. That story, obviously, big hip fan, Gord Downey's final days. Did this process of writing the book allow you to take a step back and truly appreciate all these significant moments? Because it's not a trivial life you've lived, Peter.
No, I mean, it still falls under that opening phrase I had about how lucky I've been. I mean, as a journalist, you get to be at the front lines of the writing of history that you guys are experts in. And, when I consider the places I've been around the world and around the country, there's nothing like actually being there in the moment, especially, in something, like the Berlin Wall, as you mentioned. I mean, the world changed in that moment, that weekend. And I was there. I was lucky enough to be there. This baggage handler from Churchill, as I often say, sitting in the White House across from Barack Obama, being in South Africa at Nelson Mandela's funeral, being on the Great Wall of China when Mao was still alive in '76. All these things and all the political conventions and election nights and all of that. When I sat down and started to write this book, I mean, Simon & Schuster wanted a memoir. I said, I don't want to write a memoir. It's kind of presumptuous of me to, write the big memoir. I mean, who cares about my life? But I said, what I will do is I'll tell stories, the kind of stories that I tell with friends at dinner or in a pub or what have you, which is kind of the story behind the story. Mm-hmm. And that's what a lot of off the record is, like things that kind of happened in, like Obama in the White House, stuff that wasn't on the air the night I did the interview with him. But in my mind, it was, the best stuff that happened there. But, there are 60 or 70 anecdotes in the book that are kind of like that. That's the story behind the story that'll give you some sense of the moment in time, often that's in the history books, and yet you never looked at it this way. And so that was the fun part of it. And as I started writing it, by the time I was sort of halfway through it, I was saying to myself exactly what you said, Steve, which is, man, like I've seen a lot of stuff, and how lucky I was to have seen it and met the people that I met, whether it was Gord Downey or Margaret Thatcher or whoever it was. They were all experiences that were, helped shape me into the kind of person and journalist that I am.
And there's so many, yeah, like you said, there's so many good stories in the book. Like, as you're going through the process, you obviously can't include like everything that's happened to you in your life and your career. Were there some stories that you weren't able to include just because you ran out of space, or maybe it was a decision to not include it? Is there anything, that's missing from this, from off the record that you could share?
You mean for volume 2?
Yeah, yeah. Sneak peek for the second volume.
No, I mean, there were a few stories that I dropped for space because we were trying to hit a particular count in terms of page numbers in the book.
Mhm.
But these were the best of the best. Now, since I finished writing it, I thought, oh, I should have told that story, because I had nothing written down as such. I had memories.
Mhm.
And so I sat down and did most of that book in my backyard during the summer of 2020. And I would go out, 5:30 in the morning, sit down. I'd start writing, and I'd write one story, and it would, in my mind, it would click into another story, and I'd write it. So we had this sort of collage of stories, and then it was a matter of sitting down with the editor at Simon and Schuster and coming up with, an order for the book.
Mhm.
And they wanted, aside from all the anecdotes, they wanted 3 substantial chapters. They wanted something that would explain kind of like who I am and where I came from. They wanted my thoughts on journalism, and then they wanted a kind of a concluding chapter on my feelings about Canada. And so those took a little more time and energy to write than the anecdotes, because the anecdotal stories are, what are there? There's like 70 chapters in the book, and most of the stories are, 2 or 3 pages long, which is probably being part of the reason, I must say, as to the success of the book. I mean, it was an instant #1 bestseller. It's been on the best-selling list for 4 months now.
Mhm.
And a lot of the reaction I've had from readers who've written to me on my podcast to talk about the book all say it's that kind of short story thing. They'll go to bed at night and they figure I'll read one, and they end up reading 3 or 4 because they're kind of easy to read. And the book doesn't take long to read. Let's face it, you can read that book certainly in a weekend, if not in a day, because of that nature. You don't get bogged down in anything. You just move on, and you can actually pick it up anywhere, right? You can open the book anywhere and read the story. It doesn't matter what's come before it or comes after it, for that matter.
Yeah,
and I like that it could be almost a reference book, because you can always say, well, I wonder what Peter Mansbridge thought about that event in history. Did he have anything to say about that? And then you can
Right.
go back to it, because it's roughly chronological. And
Right.
I must say that I do appreciate the postscript at the end of most of the stories too, because you're then reflecting on that memory,
Yeah.
each time, and that gives even more sort of nuance and context to each of them.
Sure.
And Peter, I just wanted to jump in there for a second, because again, I agree. Like, there's nothing. Sometimes I think when you're reading a book that has like very long chapters, it's almost it's frustrating and daunting to try to get to that next break point. But having those chapters that you can kind of get through, quite easily, I think kind of empowers you to keep going. But one of the things I did want to ask you, not just to talk about ease of readability, was, Steve and I had both after we finished reading the books had talked about how the chapter on Canada, I think, was probably the most the one that resonated the most with me. Certainly I enjoyed all of the stories, but I really felt that what you wrote about Canada in that concluding chapter, I think is important, that a lot of Canadians, like all Canadians, should be reading that. Have you heard from, from other people that that's a chapter that's kind of stuck out to them the way that it has with Steve and myself?
Yeah. Absolutely. And from a range of people, former cabinet ministers, prime ministers, sports figures, and just like kind of ordinary people who've written, either written their own stories or are voracious readers, and they felt that the chapter on Canada really touched them in a way that, and in part many of them hadn't thought of before. So it's important. It's my experience. It's how I feel about the country, which, I love, but I don't get carried away with loving it so much that I don't understand that there are issues that we haven't dealt with historically. And until we do, we're not going to be the country we want to be.
Yeah, I think it was when you're talking about those three, I think you reference it as a trilogy, the three things that sort of really put into focus what a Canadian is. God, uh, really holding back like some tears, if I'm being honest, Peter, because like it's at once, there's a bit of sorrow, but also pride you feel when it gets, a fine point about what it is to be a Canadian, which I think you say, Canadians care. And I think that is such a moving sort of realization you came up with.
Great. Oh, I'm glad it touched you as well.
Just I must say, growing up and indeed in adulthood, Peter Mansbridge's voice is often in the background of my family home, and then now with my adult family. Have you ever? I think Canadians sort of define you through your work with the CBC, and I should say the on-camera work you've done with the CBC. But if you were able to define your own legacy, what would you want to include in your time at the CBC and afterwards?
Well, I just want to be known as a guy who was who loved his job, who was a good journalist, not a great journalist, but a good journalist, and loved telling stories, primarily about our country, but not exclusively about our country. And I had the opportunity to do that through on a number of platforms. I mean, I've been lucky. I've been in the business for 55 years, 50 of them with the CBC. And with the CBC, it was radio first, then television. Since then, I've moved into documentary work that I do on my own, but sell back to the CBC. I've got a big doc coming up in April on the Arctic. I was up, Arctic is one of my favorite places, as you know, from reading the book. And I was back up there for a couple of weeks going through the Northwest Passage again. And there's a documentary on Arctic sovereignty, and it's partly about climate change as well. So I do that. I do daily podcasts, which is, you mentioned earlier, and it's one of the top rated Canadian political podcasts. And I love doing that. It started as a hobby. I mean, I do it right here where we are. There's a little microphone I have for it. But so I'm in my little office in Stratford, Ontario, in the den of my home. And podcasting has been great fun. It's liberating for me. I mean, I spent all that time doing newscasts and believing the role of a newscast to present as much information as possible, allow the viewer, the listener, to make up their own minds about a subject. The podcast is a little more liberating in the sense I can go as long as I want, and I can basically say whatever I want. If I have an opinion, I can share it, which is something I didn't do before. I sit on a few boards, which is fun. I teach a little bit give the odd lecture at the Monk School, the University of Toronto. So I'm actually doing more than I did when I was anchoring the National, but I set my own pace, and that's the beauty of it.
The podcast that Steve and I do is weekly. So how do you do the daily? Because I mean, him and I are always just, I think we thought it'd be a weekly podcast, and it is, but we find ourselves having to think we need another episode because we're running out of content for, the month of February. So who else can we get? How do you keep it going day after day?
I'm up early every morning. I'm usually up by 5:30. I do the podcast at around 7 or 7:30 in the morning, and as you know, you can go as long as you want with podcasts. Now I'm limited somewhat because Sirius XM bought the distribution rights for its satellite radio service, and it's on every day at noon on them. So I can't be more than an hour. But I'm usually in the sort of 35 to 40 minute range, and for them that's perfect because they can fit in commercials and what have you. But the content, how you fill it, I mean, I hate to say it, but the pandemic's been good for podcasts. There's always
doubt.
something to talk about as a
No
result of
doubt.
that. So I try to do that. I try to do kind of a pandemic update every Monday. So that kind of takes care of that show. Wednesdays, I do something called Smoke, Mirrors, and the Truth with my friend Bruce Anderson in Ottawa, where we kind of we try to dismantle certain arguments that are played out politically in terms of what's smoke and mirrors and what's the truth. And then Friday, which is the most popular podcast that I do, is called Good Talk with Chantal Hébert from Northern Ontario, and Bruce again from Ottawa. So today, it's been this particular week has been a crazy week in Ottawa, between Aaron O'Toole's departure and the trucker thing, and so we had no trouble at all filling an hour ranting and raving about that one. And Thursday, I try to make a kind of your turn edition. I get a lot of mail, some of it nice, some of it not so nice, but the mix makes for a nice show, and it's very popular out there with listeners. I mean, I've had the arrangement with Sirius for just a year, February of last year, and there've been over 2.5 million downloads. And I don't really know what that means. It sounds good.
Yeah, I think it's good.
And and I know Sirius likes it a lot because they distribute the podcast, and therefore they get a cut. They get their cut. So they're happy, and so I mean that's kind of how I do it. The one other day of the week is Tuesday, and I keep it open for whatever I might want to do. This past week, I did a show on electric vehicles, which there's a lot of interest in that story. Even most people, if they don't have an electric vehicle, which is the majority, but if they don't have one, are convinced they're going to have one in their lifetime. So they're interested in the story about battery life and charging stations and all that kind of stuff. So there's always topics out there, and that's the beauty, as of podcasts, is you can pick whatever topic you want. If you're interested in it, the odds are there are going to be some other people interested in it as well, and away you go.
That's for sure. And I think it's so interesting you mentioned, I actually listened to the EV episode where you had Charlotte Yates on, who was a wealth of information and a really good resource to bring on, right? It's always important to bring people that are much smarter than you on a particular topic onto the podcast to elucidate those things.
That's hard to do though, Steve, right? It's
really
hard
to
find
you're right.
people that are smarter.
It's very difficult, less difficult for some of us like Mike and I, but Mike and I actually are running a research center that focuses on EV powertrain development at the college here in Sudbury. And one of the things we think about when we think higher level, because we get right down into the technical of some of those new drivetrains and battery chemistries that are coming out all the time, but is this, like, just in your view and your talks you had with Charlotte, is this the sort of shot in the arm the Canadian auto sector has been waiting for to regain? And if we're already talking about it on podcasts, have we already missed the boat as Canada on this trend, or do you think there's lots of more opportunity we'll take advantage of?
Yeah, I think there's lots of opportunity, but you got to be ready for it. I mean, as Charlotte Yates, she's the president of Guelph University, right? As she pointed out, I mean, for Canada, there's so much at stake, not just in the main automotive industry, in the big plants that exist in our country, but perhaps more so in the auto parts industry, which, in the case of Ontario and Quebec, is a dominant part of the economy. And, the parts business is going to change dramatically over these next 10 to 20 years as EVs become more and more the force. I can't remember what the figure is, but, in traditional gas-powered vehicles, the number of parts in a vehicle is, there are hundreds. In an electric vehicle, as there are nowhere near that many. And so the parts industry is going to be impacted to a great deal. to, millions, hundreds of millions of dollars and thousands of jobs. So that's where we've really got to be ready. I mean, the major plants are doing what they do. I mean, you saw the GM announcement last week or 2 weeks ago, putting $7 billion into retooling their plants for EVs. And man, that's a lot of money. And it's a huge story that's kind of bubbling along in the background for a lot of people. But it's going to be very much up front as the years move ahead.
Well, Peter, and I know that you've been so generous with your time, and I've got a couple of quick ones for you here, just to kind of switch gears back, because I know that Steve was dying to talk to you about EVs, and so I don't want to cut him off from continuing that, but I did want to kind of tie it back with a nice little bow with the term, like the theme of the Unlikely Innovators. And so obviously throughout your career and currently with the podcast, you get to talk to a number of innovative Canadians, from scientists to astronauts. When you think of Canadian innovation, is there a particular person, that sticks out to you?
Well, like we have so many innovators in different fields and have done historically, like when you look at the development of, vaccines and insulin and all that on the health front. That continues to this day with the great research that's done at various places across the country. We have innovators in business. I'm dealing with Jimmy Pattison in British Columbia to do a thing later this year with him. Guy's 93, right? He's still as active as any one of the three of us, and he literally went from basically a small town auto dealership to, a multi-billionaire with all kinds of different things. His innovation on business, not necessarily some new idea or some new product, but the way to do business, has been terrific. Chris Hadfield, who's a friend of mine, and I'm sure you guys have talked to him at different points. I mean, there's a guy who's an innovator with a simple idea, like when I go up in the space station, I'm going to take pictures and I'm going to make a book out of it. And I'm going to sell it and become one of the best-selling books in the world, right? That guy's an innovator on so many different levels. And he just came out this year with a fiction, a novel, a book on something about space, and you think, well, why was that never done before? I mean, sure, Jules Verne did it, but what about now with people who actually know what goes on there? Well, away Chris went and did it. So he's a great innovator. I mean, it's part of our traditions, our entertainment industry. In terms of music, you talked about Gord Downie, and there was an innovator of a particular style that was extremely popular with Canadians, and for the most part, just Canadians. But he turned that into, a status for himself and his band that sets them apart from everybody else. And I mean, the sports scene better than I do, Mike. But we've got, we got innovators there. Not only those who played the game, but those who are behind the game. So, we've, I think there's lots of examples of great Canadian innovator stories. So many of which started with, an idea and a belief that they could turn that idea into something that worked out to their benefit, but to the country's benefit as well. And that kind of motivation for people will still exist, and only get better as we move on.
And you mentioned the sports scene. I've got to ask you this one because it jumped out to me as I already mentioned my hockey, predilection. So I want to kind of close out with this, but, in your book, so I'll tie it back to the book, you said growing up in Ottawa in the 50s, there was no home team. So you had to pick, either red or blue, and you picked blue, which I'm happy about because I'm a Leafs fan. But when we're talking today, it's been a couple of days since the Leafs celebrated a dubious milestone, which is that it's been 20,000 days since they last won the Stanley Cup. So the question I wanted to ask you, and whether or not you're still following the Leafs to this day doesn't matter, but do you think we'll see a championship in Toronto in the NHL in the next little bit? Or are we going to be celebrating another dubious milestone in another 10, 15 years?
I'm a believer, right? I believe, and I believe in the Leafs. I especially believe in Kyle Dubas and Sheldon O'Keefe, the GM and the coach right now. I think they've made some terrific moves. I mean, I think it's unfortunate what's happened to the Leafs in the playoffs in the last few years, but they have an incredibly exciting team with a couple of the best players in the world. That play for Toronto. I'm still a Leafs fan, diehard. I'm also a kind of a Winnipeg Jets fan because I spent a lot of time when I lived in the West, and I was there when they first came back with Bobby Hull in the early 1970s. Covered that story. I actually traveled with the team for a while, doing a documentary on their first year. But I'm still a Leafs fan. I still believe. I want to believe that they will win a cup in my lifetime, so they better get going. I was never able to get to games when I was doing the National, but I'd signed up long ago to be a season ticket holder, and it came through at the same time as I retired. So I'm a season ticket holder for the Leafs, and I love going to the games. It's been hard these last couple of years because of the pandemic, but hopefully by the time they raise the cup later this year, we'll all be back there in the in the arena. I think there's a chance. I think they're as good a team as anybody right now. Do they have weaknesses? Sure they do, and anything can happen in the game, and anything can happen in the playoffs.
Yeah,
as we've witnessed over time. I mean, look how a team went from the Stanley Cup Finals last year to the most pathetic last place finish they seem to be going in this year. Not that I would wish ill on the Habs at all.
Well, of course not. No. Well, I hope that prediction holds true. I like to believe every year I feel like I'm saying this is the year, and then it's next year is the year, and on and on. But I think that's the beauty of the playoffs, that anything can happen as long as you get in. You never know, and I think the team is built well. So yeah, I'm looking forward to that. So let's hope that maybe we can reconnect. Celebrating a Leafs championship sometime in June.
I hope so.
Peter Mansbridge, thank you so much for spending this half hour with us. The book again is Off the Record, and you're so generous with your time, and really a pleasure. You sort of made a dream come true for Mike and I. So it was really great to talk to you, and thanks again for joining us today on the Unlikely Innovators.
Well, thank you, Steve, and thank you, Mike. It was a treat to chat with both of you, and look forward to the next time I'm out there near the Big Nickel. It'll be good.
Yeah, we'll shine it up for you.
Yeah, okay.
Steve, I'm so happy that I get to say once again that was a great chat with Peter Mansbridge. And maybe just a little bit of backstory here, because I think it is, I think it's important for the listeners to kind of figure out how some of these guests kind of come to be. And I think, I think I explained this a little bit in the opening question that we had with Peter, was that, I had read his book Off the Record over the holidays, and, I'm obviously familiar with his career at CBC, having, seen and heard him over the years. But one thing that jumped out at me that I maybe wasn't aware of, as I was growing up, was that, he was a baggage handler at the Churchill airport, and then ended up becoming becoming the chief correspondent for the CBC, kind of through happenstance of being able to kind of make this announcement at the airport and kind of getting discovered by somebody. And so I thought, what, nothing is more unlikely than that. We have a podcast called the Unlikely Innovators. It would be really cool if Peter Mansbridge came on the podcast and kind of, talked about his storied career. So I just, on a whim, sent him an email, and he got back to me. again, I think you and I both wanted to ask the question, like, why are you here? But I mean, I think, I don't think we would have needed to ask that because, again, I think he's just somebody who appreciates the craft, telling stories. So again, we were so thrilled that he spent some time with us today, to kind of walk through some of the stories in his book and maybe explain some of the stories in his life.
Yeah, and Mike, I would love if you told the story. So sometimes we send a collection of questions we want to ask our guests, just to make sure they're comfortable with the subject matter. Tell us what Peter said when you sent that off to him.
Yeah. So again, it's funny now, like thinking back to that email, right, where I'm emailing Peter Mansbridge and saying, and I'll send you some questions in advance. He kindly replied back that he didn't need questions. And it's like, of course he doesn't.
Of course he doesn't. He's Peter Mansbridge.
Yeah, so, but again, I just think of such a seasoned vet because, even if I'm on a podcast, like I would like questions in advance to kind of know, but I mean, we went through everything with him from, the Maple Leafs to electric vehicles to moments in his life and his career. And of course, like you would have thought that, he had seen any of the questions in advance, but again, I think he's just such a, gifted storyteller and orator that, he took them all in stride, and it was a great chat.
Yeah, and I think one thing I noticed is just he still has a great deal of humility, right? He honestly said, I wrote this book, and I wasn't really sure at the time if anyone would be interested
why would anybody
in my
want to
life.
read about my life?
That's like I think there's quite a lot of people, especially Canadians, who would want to read about your life. So
yeah,
rest assured, Peter, there are tons of people out there wanting to know more about your life. So again, thank you for coming on the pod with us today.
Yeah, and I mean, I think he's also reinvigorated my belief in the Toronto Maple Leafs, which is difficult to do. But if anybody could do it, it's Peter Mansbridge. So again, hoping that prediction holds true. And if nothing else, just such a thrill to have him on and get to chat with him today. So
yeah, and I don't know how we'll top this one, but we'll strive to do so.
We will find a way. So again, thanks for joining us this week. It's been a real treat, and we'll see you next week.
Bye-bye.
The Unlikely Innovators with Mike Commito and Steve Gravel, presented by Cambrian R&D and the Center for Smart Mining.